Thanks for all of you for being here to enjoy James Grippando talk in a little different way and in an interview format, which is going to be very nice. And after last night's event, we're still ready for more. And we're all going to love it, and we appreciate both of you being here.
Terrific.
So we can have some more of you, James.
Thank you.
Yeah.
James Grippando, I'm Norman Gilliland, and happy to see you. And if your friends are coming late, that's fine too. So, we'll be talking for an hour, roughly, and James may say some of the same things he said last night if you were there for that, but I invited him also to contradict himself, just to make things more interesting. And, you know, it's showbiz to an extent. How many of these do you do in a year, these appearances?
So most of the appearances that I do are right around the release of a book. And in the last few years, that seems to, I've been in the January slot. Fortunately, Koller Library, in their wisdom, decided to invite me in May, not in January. And so, but this will actually be probably the last event that I do for Code 6, because it's ready to start thinking about Goodbye Girl, which will be my next novel coming out in January.
Pretty tight schedule then. Okay, so let's see, Code 6 was the 30th book?
30th novel, yeah.
The 30th novel, and Goodbye Girl then 31, and that's the 1924 book. And then why not plug now 2025? And do you want to tilt us in that direction?
So I just sold the outline for that to HarperCollins. I've been with the same publisher, HarperCollins, since 1993. So all 30 of my novels were with HarperCollins, and I just signed a contract to do 2 more. Now, both of those, Goodbye Girl in 2024 and the next 2 novels, are all going to be in the series, Jack Swyteck series. So fans of the series will be happy to know that. Code 6 was the first standalone novel that I've done, I think, since 2015. So it'll be at a point now where of the 31, 32 novels, 19 or 20 of them will be in the Jack Swyteck series.
Hard to keep track after a while.
Yeah.
Do you ever pick up one of your novels and say, well, yeah, pretty good, or I might have done that a little differently?
So, you know, I have not gone back and read any from cover to cover, any of my novels. Sometimes I have to go back to the novel to check, for example, because I write a series, I have to make sure that Jack or his, you know, the surrounding cast is acting consistently, because I definitely will get emails from people with someone like, didn't you kill that guy off, 6 books ago or something? And oh, sorry, yeah. So for that purpose, I will go back, and I think to answer your question specifically, Jack Swyteck is a criminal defense lawyer who defends death row inmates in the first novel. He evolves beyond that and just becomes more of a general practitioner, but he has a very important mentor in his life named Neil Goderich in The Pardon. Neil dies in a book called Afraid of the Dark, and there have been times when I wish Neil was still around, because Jack would have that kind of sage to go back to in life. But you make these choices, you go with what works for the particular story you're writing, and then sometimes you just have to make it work in the rest of the series.
We sometimes have that problem when we do chapter a day, and inevitably we're trimming the book a little bit, and every now and then, if it's a whodunit, oh, yeah, we killed off the perpetrator. Go back and redo things a little bit.
Yes,
yes.
Right.
So, yeah, with that many in the Jack Swyteck series, there must be an awful lot of balls to juggle.
It is, and a big help in that regard was the fact that for like the first 15 Jack Swyteck novels, I had the same editor, Carolyn Marino, at HarperCollins. So she was sort of this repository of institutional knowledge for the the series, and she would, I think she knew the series better than I did sometimes, and so she would kind of keep me on track. Now, Carolyn retired 3 books ago, so that's been a bit of an adjustment, and actually, honestly, it's been a little bit of a greater burden on me to make sure that I don't have Jack doing something inconsistent. But it's not just that, it's just that I think it's more importantly is that Carolyn would provide direction on how Jack should grow. I mean, for example, she was really, really picky about who Jack was going to marry. Right? I mean,
wait a minute, who's writing this book?
Yes, right. And I introduced 2 or 3 women to Jack, just starting with Hear No Evil and Last to Die, and she's like, no, she's not right. Yeah, she's not right. So, and then what do? Unfortunately, one of them met an early demise, which moved
Take
the
that,
story.
Carolyn.
So yeah, and then finally, Carolyn was sort of great at just sort of making polite suggestions, and she's like, "What about that character, that you developed in a book called Under Cover of Darkness?" And that was Andy Henning, who was an FBI agent, who was completely geographically inconvenient for Jack. Jack's in Miami, she was in Seattle, and I'm like, well, how are we going to do that? And well, anyway, figured out a way to make that work, and so now. Andy Henning and Jack probably, I'm guessing now, they're together in 7 or 8 of the books. So that one stuck, with Carolyn's approval.
Well, I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah.
When you approach, let's kind of look at the chronology of how these things come about. You have a concept. You're fresh off of writing the previous book and even, talking about the previous book. You mention it first to your agent, HarperCollins. You're saying, I want to do a standalone, or you think they say, well, we really want another Jack Swyteck. How does all that play out?
Yeah. So I'll take you back in time. I was represented by a father-son team, Artie Pine and Richard Pine. Artie's no longer with us, but I'm still with Richard all these years later, since 1992. But I had an exercise with Artie that was really, really instructive to me, and I tell it to all aspiring writers. And this is how the process sort of works. I would call him, this is back in the day, before everybody just talks on email, right? You would actually pick up a phone and talk to somebody, and I would tell Artie, I got this great idea, and it's like I would start blabbering on, and he would stop me and say, you know what, just, write a few pages down and send them to me. So, and of course I would write down the few pages, and then I'd send them off by showing my age, fax, right, to him. He'd call me back and say, try to just cut it to a page. I think that would help your focus a little bit. So I'd say, oh man, how am I going to get this down? So I would go and I'd get it down to a page and send him the fax. He would call me back and say, I think a paragraph would be better, right? And I'm like, a paragraph? How am I going to get my book idea down to a paragraph? So I'd get it down, I'd send it to him. He'd call me back and say, okay, I want 1 sentence.
Oh my gosh.
And I want you to start it with, this is the story of. And you
Can it be a complex sentence? I mean, look at Hawthorne, all one page.
But once I went through that exercise, at that point I didn't need to call him back. I knew what the story was about, and that's a valuable exercise to go through. It's not always easy to get your story down to 1 sentence. Actually, it's extremely hard to do that, but it requires a level of thought that will bring a focus to your writing that you wouldn't otherwise have. And I mean, that was a pivotal point in my writing career, because prior to that, I would be at a stage where I might write as much as 200 pages that ended up in the garbage, right? And now, very little of what I write ends up on the cutting room floor, so to speak.
They have these things called log lines, don't they, where you're supposed to be able to summarize War and Peace in 1 sentence.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's doable.
But it kind of emphasizes well, of course, it does help you to focus on the one hand, but also is a marketing tool when the book actually comes out.
That's true, right? Because you do need that sort of pitch, but and it's handy in both ways. It really is a useful exercise, and I don't know why more people don't do it, because you raise a good point. Is that you are going to have to do it once you start talking about the book and promoting the book. You might as well know what the one-liner is before you go. So.
Well, let's look at Florida then, and your background in Florida and how that may have affected your writing career, at least early on. You went to the University of Florida?
I did. Actually, I started at the University of Illinois because I grew up in Northern Illinois, so I was there for 1 year. And while I was there, my parents moved to Florida. Father retired. And at my end of my first semester at University of Illinois, it was 7 degrees when I left Champaign-Urbana. And when I landed in Fort Lauderdale, it was 77 degrees. And I literally filled out my transfer papers over the Christmas break. So I started as a sophomore at the University of Florida and went there undergraduate and law school.
So what then would have been your major?
So I was a political science major, undergrad. But I focused more on I took the honors route in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, which was run by a professor named Sid Homan, who's head of the English department, and I had him for 2 years in a university. I was very, very lucky in this regard. It was because back then, I think now there's like 55,000 students at UF. Now but even then there were close to 30,000 students, and for 2 years, for 5 hours a week, there were 6 of us with Sid.
And nice work if you can get it.
Yeah. So it was really fabulous.
Were you thinking pre-law all along then?
I knew I wanted to be a lawyer since I was about. My parents took me. There were 5 children in our family, and our parents did make a point, and I think this was a really great thing. They would we do family vacations, but they would also do individual, take one child, right, on a trip. And they took me to Springfield to see Abe Lincoln's law office and all of that, and that really stuck with me. So really, from that trip on, I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. So that was the goal for me. But in the back of my mind, the dream was to be a writer.
And how did you think you were going to combine those?
Yeah, I never really thought I was, right? I knew I always loved to write. And so, and I started writing a lot of academic articles, right, for law reviews and such. And so even, people thought I was really on track to become a law professor, because even when I was a young associate in the law firm, I was publishing in, the University of Virginia Law Journal or something, George Washington University. These are scholarly journals, that I was writing, which is not easy to get published in those. And so, there were law professors who were envious of what I was doing, but I'm not saying that in any way prepared me to write commercial fiction. Totally different exercise. But I think it was another manifestation of just my urge and love of writing. You had this career in law, and what kind of law were you practicing? So I had really a great job. Probably the best job I ever had, first out of law school, was working for a federal judge on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the appellate court right below the United States Supreme Court. So the 11th Circuit covered Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. And I worked for a judge named Tom Clark. And at the time, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals was the court of last resort for most death penalty appeals, right? And so, and at that time in the early 80s, Florida and Georgia were executing more death row inmates than the other 48 states combined. And so that was my first exposure to that kind of I mean, the stakes don't get any higher, right? Obviously. And I remember, the judge agonizing over these decisions, and I can also, remembering, what if they got the wrong person sometime, and so that became an inspiration in a lot of ways for the first book I wrote, The Pardon, in which Jack Swyteck defends a death row inmate that is hours away from execution, and Jack believes his client is innocent. So there's a lot of tie-in there. Very little tie-in to my practice of law thereafter. I was a commercial litigator. Mostly the disputes were about money, right?
Imagine that.
And yeah. But even so, I can honestly say that not a single case I've worked on as a lawyer has been an inspiration for a plot for a book. But most definitely characters that you meet in these settings, because even though it's commercial disputes, you get into trials and you see people, do courageous things. They'll come forward, they really have no stake in this, but just to tell the truth. And then you'll just see snakes who you've got to step on their tail to force them to tell the truth. And so all of that, I think, sort of factors into my writing now, and I think probably if I had to put one label on it as to what really helps me most in my writing that I take from the practice of law is that, whether it's a commercial case or it's a criminal case or whatever it is, you need to understand motive. Why do people, what do they want? Why do they want it? What are they willing to risk in order to get it? All of that is part of the equation in the practice of law, and all of that makes for realistic characters when you're developing a story in a novel.
I was kind of reminded of Charles Dickens, who was sort of a court reporter early in life and spent a lot of time just sitting in what otherwise could have been a really boring courtroom, a lot of technical procedures, but he got a lot of his character ideas from the characters that he came across in those proceedings.
I'm not surprised. I did not know that story, but I'm not surprised. You really do. I mean, people lay it out in a courtroom in a very public setting, and oftentimes I think they surprise themselves, right? And because it's real.
So if you were in a conversation with Jack Swyteck, what would you be talking about?
Oh, wow. Well, I think we'd probably, he has a daughter now and I have two daughters and a son. So I think we'd be talking about his daughter Riley, and I would probably be sharing with him being a good father. Right, I think that's the thing I'm most proud of in life. I have awesome kids, I really do, and my wife and I didn't read any instruction manual on that.
Not that it would do a lot of good.
Yeah, and so now that. And this is one of the great things about writing a series where you choose, and you do make a choice about whether your character is going to age or not, right? And so Jack Swyteck, who was 28 years old and unmarried in The Pardon, now in Goodbye Girl, coming up, the next novel, has an 8-year-old daughter and has been married for 9 years, and things evolve. And so he's a little bit behind me, so I think maybe I'd have some words of wisdom for him on that. So, yeah.
Which might come out in some later books.
It might. Actually, it's inevitable. It will be there. Yeah.
Let's get into Florida as a setting. How does Florida affect other than the death penalty, I suppose? How does Florida act as a setting for your books? Yeah.
So it's interesting because I think of Florida sort of like a hybrid. It's a setting, but it's almost like another character in the book.
And sometimes they'll say you got plot and character and setting, but setting can be a character.
Yeah, and Florida makes a fascinating character, right? It's just and
More every day.
Yeah, and either people have visited there or want to visit there, or definitely have a vision of what Florida is, and so that makes Florida sort of an intriguing character for the book, and also over the time period that I was writing, I mean, Florida having gone to school in Gainesville, I had no idea what North Florida was like. North Florida is the South, without a doubt. It is the deep South. And then I would go home for breaks and I'd go to Miami, which is,
The North.
Yes, yes. Well, it's not only the North, but it's also South America.
Yeah,
and
Cuba,
so it has all of that, and the other component to it is it doesn't. If I think of South Florida especially as a character, it's almost like this, JFK, the reckless youth, right? His era of his, sort of, it just makes mistake after mistake, and it seems like no matter what controversy or newsworthy item is at the top of the news, there always seems to be a South Florida connection to it, from whether it might be the fact that the 9/11 pilots all trained in South Florida, to, now book banning in the news, right? If you're talking about Florida. So it just seems that it's just rich in terms of being relevant for a good way or a bad way. And so that makes, I would say, even a couple of my standalones I set in Florida, not just the Jack Swyteck novels, because it's just
irresistible.
It is. That's a good word for it. It really is. Yeah.
We'll go to North Florida then, which, kind of in full disclosure, I'm actually from Gainesville, Florida, so some of these things resonated with me.
You and Tom Petty.
And that's right. We both went to Gainesville High School, Tom Petty and I, and two members of the Eagles too.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, Don Felder and Bernie Ledden. Yeah, it was quite the fermenting ground for culture, let's put it that way, in the broad sense. But you mentioned North Florida being south, for sure, and we're talking about Live Oak in particular, which is about 30 miles north of Gainesville. Yeah, so pretty close to the Georgia line. What was your experience in North Florida?
So, my first taste of it, to getting out of Gainesville, was, it's sort of a rite of passage if you go to the University of Florida, is to float down the Ichetucknee River, which is a spring-fed river. There's this underwater caves, springs that feed this whole river system that goes like from Tallahassee all the way down almost to Orlando. And so that was my first, floating down in an inner tube with the 6-pack. You can't do this anymore, right? In this, it's about, water's about 70 degrees, 71 degrees on a hot August day where it's 95 degrees and 95% humidity.
It's a shock.
And it felt great. But what you would, and then you would just drive through little towns though, and like Micanopy, Florida, or places where there's not even a stoplight or even a stop sign in some of them, and so it was, to me it was, I mean, I had never eaten grits in my life, so it was like it's the cuisine, it's the way of life, it's the whole feel had. I was really pretty much a Yankee, right? When I was there, I'd grown up north of Chicago, had gone to the University of Illinois for a year, and here I show up thinking I'm going to the University of Florida. I have my own, my vision of Florida was family vacations to Hollywood and Fort Lauderdale, and here I am in Gainesville, and realizing it's different here. It's just different.
You delved into the history, though. This is some of the dark history of that part of Florida.
Yeah, there is. A book I wrote in 2019 called A Death in Live Oak. I am a history buff, and sometimes history takes you to dark places. And I came across a story. I can't even remember where I first heard about it. It might have been, I think it was Professor Softly in a history class that I took at University of Florida had mentioned this story in Live Oak to me about a black teenage boy. He's 15 years old, worked in a dime store in Live Oak, Florida in the 1940s. And he developed a crush on a girl named Cynthia Goff. And
a white girl.
A white girl. And expressed his feelings for her through a Christmas card. It is like about the most innocent thing you would ever expect a 15-year-old boy with a crush to write. And said, and he wrote her a couple of lines, but he signed it with L, with love. And the girl's father, who was a state representative in Florida, found the card, went to Willie James's house, took Willie James at gunpoint from the mother, stopped by the lumberyard where the father worked, picked up the father, took the son and the father to the Swanee River, and hogtied Willie James and told him, and pushed him in the river in front of the father. And he drowned. The story, awful as that story is, it gets worse from there. There was a grand jury convened, and the grand jury heard the testimony from the three white men who tied up Willie James and pushed him in the river, and they testified that he jumped in the river. How he got hogtied, they never explained, but their testimony was that he jumped, and of course the father was afraid to say anything. And I remember coming across a letter from Governor Leroy Collins to Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall went on to become a United States Supreme Court Justice. At the time, he was working for the NAACP, and Thurgood Marshall wanted to open the investigation that resulted in no indictment, no charges brought against anyone for this. And the governor's office wrote to Thurgood Marshall, said, at the end of the day, this is the testimony of three white men against the black father, and this is going nowhere. And that's the way it stood to this day. And so I wrote, I didn't think there was, that's not what I write as a book, right? But I worked it in to the story.
Parallel stories.
Yes, in A Death in Live Oak. And even though it's a very dark subject matter, many people, I think fans of the series would rank that book in the top 3, for sure. Yeah.
As a defense attorney in these cases involving unpopular, obviously guilty clients, does he ever know going into the case or have a feeling as the case progresses as to whether they're innocent or guilty?
Yeah, a lot of that time that's the tension, right, in the story, because you don't want to, and the way I write Jack, pretty much the reader knows what Jack knows. So I don't really write the story so that Jack is hiding the ball from the reader.
Right.
So what Jack learns, the reader learns. And so, and what's interesting about that question is that, and I understand this for a lot of people, they're thinking what I'm writing is a whodunit, right? Who did he do it? Did he not do it? Is she guilty or is she not guilty? Oftentimes, I find the more interesting question to be, why did they do it? Right? Why? Right? I don't know if you read, Where the Crawdad Sings.
Yes.
Right. Okay. It's like there. I mean, I guess it was. I don't want to spoil the ending of the book for anybody listening who hasn't read it. But there's to me the why is as interesting as the who. Right,
sure.
Right,
Sure.
Right? So, that's the way I think of my books with writing about it. It's not. Sometimes there is that aha moment, like, oh God, she really did do it. Or, but other times it's more like just coming to understand the human condition that led someone to do what they did.
Do you have the sense from, your legal experience or your experience talking to other attorneys who are defense attorneys, do you have a sense of whether they have an inkling as to whether their client is guilty or innocent?
So you'll hear different things from different lawyers. Some absolutely don't want to know. It's irrelevant. Some people feel like the best way to defend them is to know everything. I can't anticipate what's coming at me as a lawyer unless I know what the answer to these key questions might be. I don't know if there's a right or wrong way to do it there, but with Jack's death penalty work in my fictional world, yes, there are innocent people on death row. Yes, there have been more than you can ever imagine people who've actually been executed and later exonerated. That happens. But, not everybody on death row is innocent. And Jack's like pretty aware of that. I mean, he doesn't go into every case thinking, yes, now I'm going to get another innocent man off of death row. That's really not. I mean, and there are entire organizations that are devoted to the Innocence Project.
The Innocence
and so
Project,
forth.
yeah.
That's really not what Jack does. He's not just saying, well, I'm not going to represent you unless you're innocent.
Right. But the real tension in the books, I think pretty much all the way through, is Jack Swyteck defending, for want of a better word, a very unpopular client. And, why would you possibly defend this person who's obviously guilty of a heinous crime?
Right. And what's interesting is that it's sort of Jack's answer to that is that it's the toughest job in the world is to defend an innocent client, not to defend a guilty client. Because if you screw up representing an innocent client, an innocent person is going to jail, right? So you're representing someone who's guilty, it's like, I'll do the best I can, but, you actually did do it. So, but we'll do the best I can. So, but even outside the criminal context, you're right. All of the stories I have, Jack takes on a case that other people don't want to take on, and that's sort of in his nature. But
even his wife, Andy, gives him a hard time.
Yeah, and I think that's why that works, right? It's because Andy is an FBI agent, and sometimes does some undercover work, and she has a sensitive position within the FBI, and so not only from the career clash that might result from a criminal defense lawyer. Andy calls him a criminal lawyer, and he keeps having a reminder, I'm a criminal defense lawyer. Okay, I am not myself a criminal.
Right.
So there's that tension between them that I think readers enjoy, and there's a chemistry between the two of them because of that. And honestly, where that will go, I don't know. And I mean, that has the potential to blow up a marriage.
I was going to say they seem to be an exception in crime fiction books as being more or less happily married couple. So often it's like, they're divorced and then they kind of get back together a little bit and then they fall apart again or whatever, which has become kind of a cliche over the years. So
Yeah.
so I'm rooting for him.
Okay, great.
Now, the Swyteck books often, if not always, are based on a kernel of a situation with Death and Live Oak. It's lynching. With 20, well, it's a couple of things. It's a combination, of course, as you mentioned, of the 9/11 pilots and conspirators, but also a school shooting, which, of course, is still today, because there's still common and there's still a threat of them, kind of a raw topic. Is there any kind of a kernel that might work for a great book 5 or 10 years from now when things have cooled off? But I mean, a school shooting was that tough for you to write about?
So I would never have made that my first novel, right? I know that was a subject matter that was really difficult to take on, and what kind of led me to write 20 is, well, a couple things. One is the fact that it did hit close to home with Parkland shooting, which my mother lived, her house was a few blocks from there. And Coral Springs police was they were the first police to respond to that. So, she's lived in that house since 1977, and it was one of those this can happen anywhere kind of moments for our family, right? My brother and sister went to Coral Springs High School, but had they been teenagers now, they would have been at that high school. It was that close to us. So that was one. And then the other thing that that struck me was I saw the interview of the fathers of one of the victims who actually pleaded with the state attorney not to seek the death penalty.
I thought that was a really interesting twist.
And this is not I'm not making a pro-death penalty or anti-death penalty statement here at all. This for him was emotionally what he was capable of handling, and he knew the reality of it is that this was every step of the way. This was going to be back in the news. There would be an appeal from the death sentence, and then there would be a habeas corpus petition from the death sentence. And 10 years from now, the process would still be going. And he had also an 8-year-old daughter, and he's like, I don't want her to be reminded of another headline 10 years from now when she's a senior in high school about the killer at this school. So that's sort of the way he was processing it, and I thought that was just such a unique perspective that and a powerful. Obviously, he thought about that a lot and thought about how am I going to move forward, and those kind of feelings like that. I don't. It's not that I'm exploiting it, but it just struck me as so powerful that I wanted to somehow capture that through my writing. And like I said, there is just no way I could have done this as a first novel, right? It's that delicate of a subject matter, and I had a new editor. That was my first. Carolyn had just retired, and so I was working with a new editor on that book, and that's her first introduction to me as a writer.
How did she react to your idea?
So she actually was very, very supportive of it, and which made me. She's not your typical thriller writer. Editor. She does more literary, her background is more literary fiction. So the fact that she felt that I was dealing with it in a proper and compelling and real way, she loved. And that, I think that may have actually sort of hastened the chemistry and the development of our relationship, the fact that was such a difficult book to write and to edit.
In this question of balance, which I think you've alluded to in terms of issues that you're dealing with. An inevitable one, of course, would be gun control. But as a writer, you feel yourself as your mission not to make a case one way or the other, but to balance, which must have been quite a balancing act.
It is a balancing act, but and you have to be fair as a writer. Now, for example, in my research for 20, staying on the school shooting, very first school shooting would have been the junior high school. It would have been a junior high school in Miami in the 1980s. But so the guy, a former employee of a body shop, went into the body shop, as you read about so often now, and disgruntled employee, and shot his coworkers. And then got on a bicycle and announced he was going to the school. And one of the workers in the body shop who survived had a gun and chased him down and shot him before he got to the school, right? So now, and I'm not saying anything. I'm not saying I'm pro-gun control or against or the huge advocate of the second. I love it that people can't guess where I stand on issues when they read my books. I just raise that, right? If that guy had not had a gun and tracked that guy down, he would have shot up the school.
You're more interested in asking questions than answering them.
I think so, and maybe that's a cop-out, people would say, but, at the end of the day, people read my books to be entertained, not to be preached to, so.
That's true, and we could, I guess, talk for a long time about the pros and cons of branding and marketing books. Inevitable part of the business now.
Right. I've been told, and I guess this was a compliment, that I am a brand now. So.
How did you discover, as we move into Code 6, how did you discover the kernel that fires that book?
So Code 6, you have to step back to actually a play that I wrote called Watson, which is the story of IBM's use of, or the Nazis' use of IBM technology during the Holocaust. And that came to me through, I love theater, live theater. I've supported a number of Broadway plays, but also a big supporter of regional theater. And Joe Adler was the executive director of Gable's Stage in South Florida for 35 years. He was legendary, really, and liked to bring edgy, new. He had a number of world premieres. At least maybe once every other year, he would develop a world premiere of a new play, which is amazing for regional theater.
Yes, it's ambitious.
Yeah. And he came to me. We got to know each other just because I was going to plays, and he started reading my books and see what I do, and came to me and told me something. I consider myself. Like I said, I'm a history buff. I thought I'm pretty knowledgeable about the Second World War. My father fought in it, and so I was very interested in it. And so, but he told me this aspect that I had no idea even had happened was the way the old punch card technology with those little rectangles in the punch cards that each
You're too young to remember those, right?
Yeah. But each of those little rectangles was a bit of information, and first of all, I had no idea how capable the electromechanical punch card system was.
Yeah, 1890?
It was invented in 1890 and first used in the 1890 census in the United States. And so by the time, 50 years later, by the time the World War II was fought, they were processing information at 20,000 cards a minute, right? Which pales in comparison, obviously, to today's computers, but that was pretty astounding. And railroads ran based on these cards, and payroll systems were developed using these cards.
And these were developed by IBM? Tom Watson Sr. in the early days.
Tom Watson Sr. led IBM through that electromechanical era, and his son, Thomas Watson Jr. Led IBM into the true computer age. So Joe told me about how the Nazis used this electromechanical information not just for business purposes, but specifically to identify who was Jewish and where they lived and what assets they had. This was based largely on census data that the Nazis had collected during. Nazis were census fanatics. They just loved information, right? And so they collected all this information through the census, and no one realized what they were doing with all that information, but they were loading it into the punch card technology and processing it pretty efficiently to get what they wanted to know about their population. And Joe came to me about, I'd like to do a play about this, and I'd like you to write it. And so there was, the subject matter fascinated me, but I knew nothing about writing a play. I'd never written a play, and I thought, you got the wrong guy. And second of all, I dug into the information and found it's a lot of information, but I didn't really see a story that could be reduced to Joe wanted a one-act, 90-minute play. And I didn't say, well, that's ambitious. I don't know how we're going to do that. You can't just have somebody stand up there talking about this. That's just not going to work. And then I did more research into the father-son, and discovered how contentious their relationship was. And then I also extracted from that, it's like, Thomas J. Watson Jr. was almost lost his leg in World War II, was a pilot, traveled around, flew over combat zones with General Bradley, and I thought, what must he have thought? Did he ever judge his father, right, about the fact that IBM did business? IBM isn't unique in that regard. It was, Ford Motor Company and Standard Oil and all that were continued. But the difference was that there was this link of the IBM technology to the Holocaust.
And Hitler actually gave a medal to Watson Sr., as he did to Lindbergh and Henry Ford.
Yeah, it was the Nazi Merit Cross of Honor, which Watson Sr. received in his capacity as president of the International Chamber of Commerce in 1937. And Watson's slogan was, back then, was peace through world trade. That was the way and ironically, Hitler gave him a medal for peace through world trade, right? What made this even more compelling to me, and that might have been the turning point when I decided to actually write the play, is that unlike Lindbergh and unlike Henry Ford was a known anti-Semite. Lindbergh, whatever you want to think about him, but Thomas Watson Sr. was no anti-Semite.
He had a good friend. Was Guggenheim a good friend of his, I think?
Guggenheim and the department store owner, forgot the name. Anyway, so that was not what this was about. He was a businessman. This was business to him. And secondly, to his credit, he gave back the medal, unlike Ford and Lindbergh. So that was coming. But then that raised the question of, well, did he give it back just because bad business to keep it? Or did he really have, a conscience? And so then I knew I had a play. And then, unfortunately, the play opened in December 2019. Did great. We had 35 sold-out performances. And then COVID hit, 2 months later, and that was that. Not only did the theater world shut down, but the world shut down. And so I had this play, the story, and what am I going to do with it? I didn't want to just write a work of historical fiction. So I can't, and I had, we talked earlier about A Death in Live Oak, where I sort of wove in some actual history into the story, and I don't want to do the same thing again, And so I actually created a character, Kate Gamble, who is writing Watson, a play about the Nazis' use of IBM technology in the Holocaust.
She has this relationship with her father, which is a lot like Watson Jr. and Sr.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, her father happens to be the CEO of not really an IBM, but more along the lines of what we read about in today's newspaper every day, the big data collectors, right? Where they're collecting all of our information, and the saying, as the saying goes, if the product is free, you are the product. We are the product. They're harvesting all of our information and then selling it. So that's what her father does. So Kate is conflicted about what her father does in the first place, and then she started writing a play about really what was the world's first personal information catastrophe, right? It's that everyone gave up their personal information, including the fact that they had a Jewish grandparent, and it was processed with state-of-the-art technology for the 1940s with horrific consequences.
But now we're giving up that information not through the census so much as through everything we touch online or through the internet.
Every time you buy a product online, every time you hit like online, even if you're holding your phone and scrolling and you pause for a couple of seconds, that is recorded.
Watch those pauses, by the way.
Yeah.
Watch those pauses.
Yeah. So I had this. With that, I had the structure for the story. I was going to weave in the play Watson as Kate's play, but it would be in a contemporary setting where, while she's doing her research for Watson and while she's coming to grips with the relevance that story has, the history repeats itself kind of warning
Sure.
that Watson is that story tells. That all plays out in the present day.
And what's the term for skimming off that information from your use of internet and these other sources?
The data
scrubbing or something to that effect?
Oh, right, yes. So that was sort of, here's the real challenge in writing a tech-based thriller, is that there's a real risk that what you're writing about now is state-of-the-art technology. By the time the book comes out, it's old news. So yes. So I was talking about, I tried not to make that too much of an element because I was afraid that this idea of scrubbing for information would be like, well, we haven't done that since, in 2 years.
Did you have to take out all the fax references in the book?
So, yeah, those are gone. Yeah, definitely. But it was a lot of research. But fortunately, I had done all the research for the play, so I had that finished. So most of the research was really trying to figure out, what is the big data industry all about, and reducing it to a level where it's still entertaining. Yeah, and I don't want people to get a headache, trying to follow the story here. But and then from there it became just a story about Kate writing this play, her conflict with her father, and her research uncovering that her father's company has a very dark secret, which as IBM for a very long time lived with that dark secret. It didn't really come to light until about the year 2000.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, nobody really knew about that. That they were the Nazis were misusing IBM technology in that way, and so it plays out in a similar way in Code 6. Kate discovers that her father's company is on this questionable journey toward the use of personal information and has certain alliances with certain countries that would give anyone pause who has a broader concern than just making money, who would give someone pause. And then when one of her close friends goes missing because she shares this information with him, that's when the story sort of takes off and becomes a typical, not typical, I don't mean that in a demeaning way, but becomes a recognizable James Grippando thriller. Okay.
Final question. Are you thinking as you write any of these books, this one in particular, wow, that'd be a great movie?
Yeah. So far, everyone east of Hollywood thinks my books would make great movies.
Really?
Yeah. So, and that would change my life. And then I have people saying, "Oh, you don't want that. They're going to ruin the book or whatever." And I'm like, "No, I would. That would be thrilling if it would do that." I do recognize that if it happened, I would have absolutely no say with how the story would be developed, and I suppose that could be a source of angst. Like who do they see Jack Swyteck? Because obviously, I'm 19 books into that. I have a very clear vision of who he is.
He just might not be available to make the movie.
Yes, exactly.
You could have to settle for Pee Wee Herman instead of,
Oh, God.
Matthew McConaughey. We got a deal on him. What can we say?
That's a frightful thought. Okay.
Well, James Grippando, it's been a pleasure.
My pleasure.
Meeting you and your books,
me.
and thanks for joining us today. And now, do you want to do more Q&A, or are you all burned out from last night's Q&A? It was a really good Q&A last night, I thought.
I thought so too. It's like I was so glad that nobody asked, do you type on a computer or a typewriter?
Oh, or longhand. Right.
Yeah.
So who do you think should play?
Oh, wow. And that has evolved over time. For example, here's something interesting, right? Is that probably the most serious interest we had in movie was The Pardon, obviously the characters are not black, but Denzel Washington wanted to play Jack, but only if Sidney Poitier would play his father, the governor of Florida. And I thought, wow, that would have been fabulous.
Yeah.
Not only, the first black governor of Florida and so forth, and all of that would have been really pretty spectacular. But then Denzel went off and it was not Hunt for Red October, but it was another submarine movie that we were doing. So that fell apart. So I'm pretty open. After that experience, it made me realize, well, wow, the casting could actually make it an even more interesting story than what I envisioned. And then there was also a time when, the same father-son thing, Matthew Sheen and Charlie Sheen, people were talking about that. So, well, that would work, too, but, Pee Wee Herman, no.
Well, okay, I'll have to call him and tell him it's off. Any more?
I was just going to say that what I really appreciate about what you have brought to us is your teaching of the writing process for a novelist. I think you have shared more about what you've gone through as a writer and how you write, and I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you for saying that, and I may incorporate that more into the future presentations. I mean, I really did this because, this was a milestone book, right? It was 30, and so I got in sort of a reflective mindset, about how did I end up, it's sort of like, it's a great, Rod Stewart, when he got a Lifetime Achievement Award, accepted the award by saying, I can't believe I've been doing this long. And he pauses and adds, and getting away with it.
There's got to be a lot of people who think that way about what they do. Yeah, that's true. Good point.
James, my takeaway from listening to you for the last 2 days is your emphasis on brevity. You talked yesterday about bringing your book down, working on getting it down in numbers, and today you spoke about bringing your ideas down to one sentence.
Yeah, it's key.
I find that in conversation.
Yeah.
When you talk to people, if you start elaborating on a story, but if you get to the point quickly.
True.
Have you ever thought of writing a really great log line and then building a book on it?
So, well, there's an idea, you know. But, you know, part of that has to do with the genre that I write in, right? So, you know, I can't go on for 2-3 pages describing the character. You've got to really look for key bits of information, right? You know, and you know, for example, right? You know, okay, so I wanted to show that this young girl is really, really smart. And my youngest daughter is really, really smart. So this is it. So I worked in this true story, which really you don't really need to know much more about this girl other than what I'm going to tell you. Is that it was Thanksgiving, and we went to a friend's house, and the friend had these, you know, Thanksgiving themed cupcakes with, you know, pilgrims hats on them and so forth, and turkeys and what have you. And Ainsley was 21 months old. And the host brings over the tray and asks her, thinking she's using really big words, Ainsley, do you want the chocolate or the vanilla? And this Ainsley looks up and goes, I'll have the cornucopia.
Whoa. It's nice sometimes to put adults in their place.
Yeah. Like, okay, that's a 5-syllable word that just came out of this 21-month-old kid. But, you know, right? I mean, I could go on for 2-3 pages saying she was really, really smart, and you know, and all like. But really, just that one scene, that's all you really know. Okay, that's a smart kid, right? You know,
Yeah. Couple more questions.
Are your books on Audible, and if they are, do you read them?
They all are on Audible, and I've never read any of them.
Do you choose the voices or the characters?
So I do get to approve the, but now it's a no-brainer. Jonathan Davis reads the Jack Swyteck novels, and I don't know what we're going to do if he decides not to read them, because for many of my readers, definitely my listeners, he is the voice of Jack Swyteck. You know, this one was a little complicated. Code 6 was a bit more complicated because we had a woman narrating it, and you know, that was so. They gave me 3 choices and asked me what I thought. I'm not sure it mattered what I thought. They were going to go with who's available, right? You know.
Yeah.
So, but mostly, I think that's true of most fiction writers, is that somebody else reads it. It's usually it's a memoir or a work of nonfiction where the author will be the reader of their own books.
Not in your case, of course, but the author isn't always a great reader.
Well, that's true. That's true.
I remember Kate Quinn had said she was real fussy about the Russian accent.
Oh.
And she interviewed quite a few people, and
That's important, you know, and that's actually the reason I listened to about 20 minutes of The Pardon. And I've never listened to any other of my audiobooks, because there was a Cuban American character in that book, and I swear to God, the reader, I forgot his name, made him sound like Speedy Gonzales.
Oh, no. Yeah.
My name is Raul, and I'm in this. You know,
God.
And I'm like, oh my God, you know, and so, yeah.
Painful. Yeah. Sarah.
For what it's worth, the audio reader for Code 6 is really good. But
Oh, I'm happy to hear that.
You've been in publishing for quite a while, and we actually have a display of your books from various ages out there. And this may be inconsequential for anyone other than like librarians that see book covers all the time, or bookstore people. But cover art has dramatically changed over the years. And like way back in the day, you probably had like a 3-color process, and they're like, what 3 colors do you want? But now you can do so much. Do you get any input on covers, or can you say, no, I hate that one? Or
Yeah, I've actually always had a lot of input on the covers. Yeah, and it's a big deal. You know, you know, we went through. Live Oak, for example, was the most difficult cover.
Really?
Yeah, they just, I mean, it was horrible that they came up with. It was like they had a tree, and you know, because of the lynching aspect,
Right.
they had the letters like dangling from the tree, and I'm like, are you kidding me? Oh,
They finally went with simple, and it
I'm
worked.
like, yeah, and then you know, and I think now it helps the fact that, well, we talked about, you know, I'm a brand, right? They used to be really sticklers about, oh, well, that cover doesn't look like a thriller. You know, they want the color to set this. If you look at the, you know, last night I had the cover up for Goodbye Girl. That doesn't really look like a thriller, right? But that's no longer an objective, because now I'm at a stage where the name goes above the title, and so they know from my name that, okay, you know, this is not a young adult novel about a girl walking on a pier. This is a girl walking on a pier, and it's like, okay, is she going to meet somebody? Is she going to jump off the pier? Or what? You know, it's like it speaks to you differently knowing something about the author. And so my title, a lot of covers got dinged just in the early years because they didn't have the look of a thriller.
well, the cover of Code 6 is very effective. I love the color choices and the punch card on the side.
Yeah. Well, you know, now we struggled with that a little bit. I don't have a copy of the book, but they had but yeah. So the first, like some of the early versions of that, the woman who's the shadow was in front of the 6, and it just looked like the name of the book was Code. You couldn't even tell the 6. So we finally worked out that, okay, you need to make it clear that there's a 6, you know, and then they tried to get too clever, like they tried to make the 6 look like a button that you would click on a mouse. Right, and then it didn't look like a 6 either, you know, and so finally we went with just kind of simple, okay, Code 6.
Any more?
I wonder if you would ever consider changing the location of a Jack novel to maybe another setting such as northern Wisconsin.
That's great. He may visit here, maybe, yeah. But I'd have to work Dillinger into that.
Oh, sure, that would sell.
Yeah, that'd
He
be
never
great.
really died.
Yes. Oh, how about that?
So Jack
Right.
could discover the real
Yes.
story.
True. And I could, you know, maybe.
Or he never really committed the crimes.
Yes, he's actually just an influencer on
Just,
TikTok. You know,
yeah,
something, you know, so-
just needed a good defense attorney, that's all. Right.
Well, this was great.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.